Jonathan, welcome to the show.
Thanks, Mike. Excited to be here.
Oh man, I think this conversation is long overdue. I think we've sort of passed in the hallway at conferences and certainly interacted over social media from time to time, but I've looked forward to talking to you for some bit of time.
Likewise, I love what you're doing with your podcast. Glad that you've interacted with me on social media with mine, and I'm excited for the meeting of the minds here.
Yep, definitely. Well, if you don't mind, I mean, just to give a little framework or context to our conversation, I love the topic of leadership. I think, you are somebody that has built a company. So my imagination tells me that you've broached the subject of leadership from time to time. Talk to us about the early innings, whether you're talking about building the company and or any other organizations you might have spent time with or invested time with. How have difficulties that you've faced really shaped your leadership style and, dare I say, character as an individual?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think, like most people that I've interviewed about leadership who are even way more accomplished than I am, having been C-levels for decades, what I would share with them is that I learned a lot from negative examples early in my career. I think there's a lot to learn there about what is demotivating, and by comparison, what might be motivating, or like what to avoid. But even so, when I got thrust into my first managerial position, which was at my own company, I needed to manage people. I did start making some of those same mistakes because I didn't have a lot of experience under my belt, and I had to quickly correct myself or bring in people who could help coach me to be a better leader. There was just so much I learned in those early days that I'm honestly like a little embarrassed by how rough it was starting out. But I think like anybody who's taken the leadership path, you learn a ton just from the experience. And no matter what books you read, no matter how much coaching you hear from your advisors, if you don't put in the reps, learn by doing and learn sometimes the hard way, I don't really think it's going to stick. And now I'm 8 years into managing folks, I guess. 10 years as a company, but we didn't really hire our first person until a couple of years in. So at 8 years in, I know a few things, at least how to operate at a smaller startup scale and scale up scale. And I'm still learning, right? I don't think anybody gets finished in their lifetime.
I think that's absolutely true. If you were advising a leader who's new to startups, probably going to see management or leadership in the next whatever 1 to 2 years, what is the one thing that you would say to them that you really need to pay attention to when you're leading people?
It's a great question. I think the one thing would be never underestimate how much people look up to you and can be influenced by your actions. I think new managers don't fully grasp the gravity of their role and how much influence you can have on the people that report to you. They're looking up to you day in and day out for signs of your positivity, optimism, encouragement, and it's small things like body language can go a long way. Is the boss showing up in a bad mood today? It could be the little ways that you acknowledge their work, whether positive, neutral, or critical. Never underestimate would be my single piece of advice.
Yeah, and I think you hit on something that's very important there. It's just as much about your actions as it is about the things that are coming out of your mouth and in terms of directives and so on and so forth. But the way you behave as an individual are also the things that people are keying off of and paying attention to and being influenced by.
Absolutely. Yeah, you body language, composure, the way you interact with third parties outside of the business. I mean, we all we all tend to interact with our employees in different settings, whether you're on a business meeting, whether you're going down the street to get a coffee. I mean, if you're not behaving well outside of work, I think that also lends a poor impression and undermines your credibility as a leader.
Yep, that's a great way to put it. So fast forward, your company has grown dramatically. 70, I think you have 70 team members, or at least in some of the research I did, 70 team members. You're in 21 states, 5 different countries. You're remote. So I assume leadership in a distributed workforce or remote workforce is very different. Maybe some of the fundamental principles are still the same, but it's a different experience. So can you sort of tell us about the difference between the two, where you're leading in person versus remotely, and what are the things you need to pay attention to there?
I think the biggest thing to pay attention to is that the communication channels need to change. When you're in an office, and I remember it very well, it was only a few years ago, you can walk around the office and manage the way that you manage, whatever way that is, in person. And it's immediate, it's direct, and there's a lot of communication information that can be transmitted through your body language.
Mm-hmm.
When you go virtual, remote, you have none of that body language. You have maybe some of it on video, but at least in my role as CEO, I'm rarely on video calls with the frontline now, the individual contributors that now make up about half of our workforce or more. And so my communication needs to be much more intentional, thoughtful, and I guess doing the same thing, trying to encourage and inspire the same way that I would in an office, but doing that through virtual means. And usually these days that's Slack messages, and even just in the text form. I haven't yet gotten to the point where I'm uploading videos on a Monday morning saying hello to everyone. I think that's actually not a bad idea as I think about it. But right now it's a lot of text communication. I do a lot of Slack updates. I send emails frequently. You lose a lot of the tonality and body language. In fact, all the body language in that. And you have to be careful and intentional.
You know, what I hear a little bit in there, and I don't want to put words in your mouth, is that there's a discipline in the way of, and you said this in a video that I was watching prior to jumping on with you, but cadence and routine are really important as it relates. Let's just apply that to meetings in your organization. How do you sort of, in my head, if you're doing a good job of cadence and routine, some of that stuff that you lose in the way of body language and other signals, you get through the discipline of a routine. Is that fair to say, or would you frame that differently?
Yeah, I think you can definitely convey that you're a consistent, disciplined leader by staying on the cadence. And that's almost like having a consistent body language when you walk around an office, right? Chest is
Yeah.
out, heads up, smile on your face. Well, if people get used to the CEO sending messages at the beginning of Business Monday and the end of Business Friday, there is something there about consistency that I think they will admire and feel comfortable with.
So sort of on that, in that vein, rather, you've you have a tremendous work ethic. I think I read that somewhere, and I'm wondering where that work ethic comes from. Like, who were the people that influenced you as you were coming up, either in your youth and or in the work world? Is there somebody or something, or is that just innate in you that you have this tremendous work ethic?
That's a really deep question. I appreciate that. I think I would say early on in my youth, I think I was driven mostly by curiosity and knowing that there's a big wide world out there to learn about and to experience many things. And I was like very, very curious as a younger person going into high school. And something about the creativity of business and entrepreneurship jumped out at me as a really great channel to funnel this curiosity because it seemed like there's so much to learn about business itself. And I seemed to have a knack for it in high school. And along with that, I think the curiosity really drives a lot of the work ethic. And I notice that because when I find myself in a, let's say, boring part of running the business, I lose energy.
Ah,
But and boring to me is something I've done before. It's not hard to do. It's technical maybe, and it's just not new. When I am pushing myself on the frontiers of what I'm less comfortable with is novel, that's where I get more energy and I lean into that. So it's a good question. I think I'm kind of tying this all together. I think I would say the curiosity fuels the work ethic, and it's not out of maybe like ego or
Hmm.
some sort of objective goal to hit a certain milestone with the business or my own.
That makes sense. I appreciate you unpacking that a little bit. I love that answer. I want to key off it a little bit and talk about adaptability in your team. So adapting to whatever circumstance or stimulus that might be coming to you at you in a business, right? But in my own mind, you need to balance innovation, where I think you need that adaptability,
Mhm.
with stability in an organization. So you're building from a stable platform, but you need to
Mhm.
adapt and exercise
Mhm.
adaptability because you need to be innovative. So how do you balance innovation and stability in your organization?
That's a good question. And I think I'll look back to the introduction of Sip With Me, where we had to do exactly that. This was about 3 years ago. We had Print With Me running as a stable, growing business that was pretty much figured out. We had the engine built and we were just scaling that with arithmetic. So Print With Me was growing nicely, but already kind of a name in multifamily housing, at least,
Mhm.
and growing very, very well. And getting back to like a previous thing I said, frankly, I was getting a little bit bored with that. I'm an
Mhm.
innovator. This thing is cruising and humming and just growing kind of on repeat. What do I do next? Well, had the idea for Sip With Me through a client conversation, and I got to go back into startup mode. For me, that was great. All the things you said, being adaptive, innovative. I pulled in a handful of people on my team to help me innovate with that. I think I handpicked them because I knew that they could handle that adaptability at the time. But I left a lot of the people on the team to focus on Print With Me at that moment, right? There
Mhm.
were maybe 30 people at the company when we were doing this 3 years ago. And I'd say 80% of the folks were still focused on the stable operations and selling and marketing of Print With Me. And then once that new product, Sip With Me, was ready to be launched and go prime time, we did have to train the rest of the 80% of the workforce on Sip With Me. Not all of them. There were people that just stayed focused on Print With Me. But yeah, it had to be something new for them. They had to learn to adapt. We were patient with that because everything was new with Sip With Me. There's a lot of different moving parts in running a coffee business compared to running a printing business, as you can imagine. And it was tough at times to strike that balance, to introduce a brand new set of responsibilities for our frontline individual contributors who were used to operating the Print With Me machine. But we got through it. And now we're here where I'd say 90% of our workforce supports both products.
Got it. Got it. Excellent. I I'm so my imagination is telling me, in sort of having a stable business, bringing a new business in, there are these moments in time where humility and lots of listening enter into the equation. So in my head, there's a little bit of unanticipated sort of leadership traits that introduce themselves into a context based on a stimulus, like a new company coming in. Are there other unanticipated, like, leadership traits that you saw present themselves that were useful to you, or even some that were not useful and caused chaos in the organization?
I did have to listen very astutely, I guess, to our VP of coffee, who we hired from retirement. He had sold his coffee business, and I was able to convince him to come back and restart a coffee business within our business. And to me, this was about 3 years ago. I was better at listening than I had been up until that point. I was, I guess, in my early 30s, but I wasn't the best at balancing my own vision with input from people around me. But I really did have to listen hard and realize that if we're going to be successful with this new Sip With Me business, of which I'm not really an expert, besides being a coffee aficionado in my own life, I'm not really an expert at how coffee is sourced, how machines are managed and supplied and maintained. And I really needed to listen to him and to others in our network who were supporting us And it was humbling. Yeah, to your original point, I was humbled by how much goes into running a coffee business. Much more than meets the eye. I think most of the people in this audience that we're talking in front of virtually today are going to be coffee drinkers because 67% of the population drinks coffee, but
Wow.
very, very few of us really know what goes into the supply chain to get that cup of coffee served.
I believe that to be true. I will not remember the name of the book, but I remember reading the name of the book, and it was basically this guy who traveled around the world thanking all the people in the supply chain as it related to whatever the product was that was coming to market, right? The guy who drove the truck, the guy who made the tires, the guy who made the brakes, and
Right.
so on and
Yeah.
so forth.
Wow. Yeah. That you could spend a full-time job thanking everybody in the supply chain. Same with coffee, right? Going
Yep.
back, and I've learned since by listening to the folks that yeah, we get our coffee supply from certain countries through certain brokers, from farms that are trusted through this chain. And um, I would love to even have more interaction at that level. But realistically, again, like if you spent so much time visiting every part of your supply chain, you would by default be neglecting other parts of your business. And it's not really what we're delivering value with. Fortunately, with my company, we partner with local roasters and we promote those local roasters in our placements on the screens. We use their branding. We're doing that to support them. We don't charge them for that. They're getting more exposure. We're buying beans from them, and we've checked their own supply chain, so we're getting comfortable that they're sourcing ethically and fairly from farmers through their brokers. But yeah, I did have to listen because not only do we care about where we source our beans, we care about who's maintaining our devices in tertiary markets.
Mhm.
We care about the technology that's going into these devices through our manufacturer. There's just so much to learn about the coffee business that yeah, it was a humbling experience. I thought it'd be kind of easy because I think by year seven, I had rose-colored glasses about starting a company. Print with me was going really well. When I look back, I kind of forgot how hard it was in the first couple years, seven
Sure.
years prior. So I thought, oh yeah, I can do it over again. No problem. Here's a great idea. We'll be a big company again with this new product that will scale this in 5 years. We'll be in 10,000 locations. Just kind of that naivete of being a founder. I think a lot of founders suffer from that over optimism.
Yeah.
But yeah, I quickly learned by doing the coffee business that there's a whole lot to learn and you have to be patient.
Yeah, definitely. And for whatever it's worth, I think that over optimism from an entrepreneurial perspective is really important. I mean, you almost have to over believe in what you're doing in order to make it happen. I want to switch gears for a second. My imagination tells me, maybe I read this, so correct me if I'm wrong, but you have a strong background in analyzing data and market trends. So let's call that data driven. But I have to imagine from time to time there are occasions in your company where you have data telling you one thing, but your gut is telling you something very different. And talk to me about times you've trusted your gut and not the data and how that's worked out, whether it be good or bad. But I have to
Yeah.
believe as an entrepreneur, you've gone with your gut instead of the data sometimes, despite your background.
Yeah, yeah, sure. I think the best example would be in the very early days of launching Print with Me. I told myself that I would just give Print with Me 6 months. I said, I'm gonna go part-time at my day job. I'm taking a gamble here. I'm foregoing a lot of income to focus on this Print with Me project. And if in 6 months the data isn't there to support me continuing, I'm just going to fold it. I told myself it would be very rigid. I told some of my good friends, I asked them to hold me accountable to that. And honestly, in the first 6 months, the usage was there, but to a small degree. But some people might know, Print with Me started in retail settings, in cafes, well before it just started in multifamily. And the usage element was really what drove our revenue. If people weren't using it, we weren't making any revenue. This was a no fee partnership for the coffee shop. And I have to be honest, after 6 months, The data wasn't that great. It
Mhm.
was the one thing that was good was that it was going up and to the right, but on a very low base of usage. We had, I mean, there were coffee shops that were making anywhere from $30 to 100, maybe our best one, maybe $200 a month in revenue. But when you think about that at scale and think about how attractive of a business that is, it's going to take a whole lot of printers to turn that into a big business. But something in my gut just said, yeah, okay, 6 months have passed. There's not a lot of usage yet. And I threw the kitchen sink at trying to boost the usage in these cafes. But I feel that over time usage will increase and this business can become big. And I kind of ignore the data. I don't remember having a certain threshold, like a go or no go point where if we didn't hit this threshold of usage, I'm going to fold the business. I never had something written down. That would have been, I think, more interesting if I did. But I just had to trust my gut that usage would continue to increase and we'd find a way to make it work.
And I have to ask, you're managing your own emotions in that. You're shoving off your accountability partners, despite the fact you said hold me
Mhm.
accountability. You're shoving those up. You're managing your let's call them emotions through that process. You also have a team, right? Even if it's small at that point in time when
Yeah.
you're doing.
Yep.
How are you from a leadership perspective? How are you managing the emotions of
Mm.
those around you who probably are reading some of the tea leaves and the signs that, hey, we may make it, we may not make it. How are you managing them in that context?
I would, I think that one trait that I've had that has been useful is over optimism. And like we mentioned earlier, I've always been able to cheerlead an idea that I really believe in and bring people around to go after that common vision, common mission together in an exciting way. Emotionally, I think everybody else that was working with us at the time, and there were just a handful of part-time contractors,
Mm-hmm.
they were still excited, even though the usage wasn't great. They weren't focused too much on that. I was inspiring them with the vision that, hey, this is really scalable. I could see this getting to thousands of locations nationwide. We're going to take on the big bad corporate printing market, and they were excited by it. Yeah, and my emotions were mixed on the back end. There was a lot of doubt. I had really smart entrepreneurs in our ecosystem of Chicago telling me that, hey, maybe I should fold this idea early, right? Like printing isn't that attractive. It's not going to grow. You're kind of going after a market that's shrinking. And so these were credible people, right? That had told me that I should fold it. Some friends were skeptical. And I remember feeling a lot of doubt because of those inputs. And I did have a few people that were very supportive in my inner circle too. And that helped balance the mixed messaging. But again, I think I just felt intuitively that there is a business here. And honestly, I think part of it was I was 26 years old and 27 in those first 2 years, and I had very little else to lose by continuing. And that's a key part for entrepreneurs to remember. You can't really plan when you start your business, right? I think the best business inspirations happen when you're not really planning for them.
Right.
But to the extent that you can maybe target which decade of your life they'll happen in, it's much easier to do that as a 20 something with very little to lose and a lot of energy to bounce back from a small loss if you do something that folds. Much easier than doing that in any later decade when you have more responsibilities, most likely.
Most certainly. I would absolutely agree with that. I'm just curious, maybe quick answer if you were to say on a percentage basis, the amount of charisma and over optimism versus, hey, there's practical application here, practical reps we need to do. How how much would you weight the optimism and the charisma in terms of influencing and inspiring the team to continue down a path that could potentially end in failure?
Oh, that's a good question. I don't I don't think you could go without either one. I think they're
Yeah.
both very important. And when I look back at that first year or two when we were fighting through a lot of doubt, I think I honestly needed both. I couldn't have done this all myself if I couldn't keep inspiring our developers to build technology. We wouldn't have been able to get the business off the ground, right? So I think you really need both. And maybe I would even say to extend that to be an entrepreneur even later in a business, you need both. You need hard work ethic. You need to be inspiring. You can't just choose one, right?
Yeah.
Um, yeah, maybe I don't know. You don't need to be the most charismatic, and you don't need to be the most hardworking person, right? Like certainly you need to put in hard work, but we don't need to we don't need to um, martyr ourselves and put 100 hours in a week, right? It
Mhm.
becomes counterproductive. So I think you need like healthy amounts of both to succeed.
Definitely. I'm really curious. I'm scratching my own itch here. Where do you draw your inspiration from? You talked about being innovative, being inspired by innovation, but you're obviously looking out into the world, be it books or other stimulus. What are some of those specifics that you're looking at to be inspired, or is that all innate in your creative nature?
Um, that's a good question. I think again it comes back to curiosity,
Mhm.
and I stay inspired when I know that the work I'm putting into the business is growing the business to some future state that's going to be new, interesting, and novel for me. And today, 10 years later, I can still say the same thing. It's just a much different stage of the business where the improvements I'm making on the business, and now they're mostly around hiring great people and in sometimes new roles for the company. I know that getting those great hires in and managing them and leading them will bring the company to a next level that is going to start to really open some interesting doors where, yeah, I could see a future not too far off where we will acquire a company and bring that in, and that's going to be a new experience. So that'll be interesting. Or do some sort of financing event that I hadn't done before that will be interesting. And I think it's all driven by curiosity. Yeah, I think that's the inspiration for me. I've kind of joked with people, half joking, I suppose, that I think it's going to be time for me to step away from the business when there really isn't anything new to do.
Mm.
And I think if Print With Me was just Print With Me, like it looked like it was going to be 4 years ago, I might have already left the business and sold it, right? Because now I see a future where we can be doing many different interesting things through different products and scaling existing products into new verticals. I am fully charged to keep going.
I love it. I love that. You said something there that I heard you talk about in a different interview, and that is talent acquisition, the importance of talent acquisition. But really, the when you became a distributed workforce, you cited some stats like Chicago's population. There's only 2% of that population in the labor force, and then so it sort of limits your ability to pull A grade talent out of a small pool, right? But when you expanded,
Right.
now you have this big pool. Talk to us about that dynamic in terms of attracting incredible talent to your organization.
Yeah, it's something I'm really passionate about. And you're right. I think the number that I crunched is that about 2.8% of the workforce
That was
is
it.
within a commute of Chicago, right? Certainly it's a decent sized pool. Chicago's the third largest city and metro area in the country. I don't want to downplay Chicago specifically, but I think even if you were in the biggest metro market, New York City, and could draw from 5% of the workforce, let's say, you're still limiting yourself to 5% of the US workforce. If you go remote, you immediately get the 100% of the US workforce, but you also get a global workforce because you're building the same muscle to manage remote people, no matter what country they sit in, right? And I mean, we could digress and go into some of that stuff some other time, but let's just say if you're domestic and by the way, it's really important to caveat that remote doesn't work for every company.
Yeah, yeah.
I am well aware and have a lot of empathy for companies that need to have an in-person aspect to their business. In fact, we need that to some extent while we're fully remote for over 90% of our workforce. We do have some people today who need to be either in our warehouse in Chicago or in a technician role where they need to be on site with our clients fixing things. And so I totally respect, and a lot of people in our primary industry, we target multifamily housing, they need to be on site. And I know that remote doesn't work for everybody. But to the extent some some company can make it work, if they're on the fence or trying it out, I think it can be really, really beneficial, at least initially with that talent pool expansion. And then, of course, the other benefits of reducing your commuting time, giving flexibility to your staff, which is in high demand these days. Those things go a long way to help attract great talent.
Definitely. Well, I know we're running up on time here, so I have one more question for you, and then I certainly want to give you the
Sure.
opportunity to share where people might find out more about your company, but certainly about you
Cool.
individually. You have your own podcast, Multifamily Excellence. I'm
Yeah.
curious, what prompted you to start that? What lessons have you taken away from that? Are you enjoying that? Is that something you're going to carry on long term?
Yeah. I have always been interested in podcasts. I've been a big podcast listener since they came on the scene and have just tons of episodes bookmarked in my phone where I've learned a ton from folks who have come before and have shared their knowledge and brought interesting guests on the show. I think for doing it for With Me and Multifamily Excellence, there were a combination of factors. One, I realized I could find it genuinely interesting to have conversations with leaders about their own leadership paths because it's something I'm passionate about and can relate with. And I knew obviously that there'd be a benefit in producing content that we can use in our marketing. And so when those two things came together, my head of marketing, Becky, and we agreed that we should give this a shot. I am now 12 episodes in terms of recorded episodes, with a couple more on the docket, and I've been really enjoying it. I'm very happy with the way the episodes have gone. There's been unique takes on leadership from many of my guests. What I found in our industry of multifamily leaders, a lot of commonality around being learners,
Mm.
curious minds. I'm kind of surprised how many people have mentioned that as one of their key qualities or attributes. It seems like there's a direct connection between curiosity and personal growth and then career success, right? And then it's just so interesting to hear about how people fall into multifamily.
Yeah,
I don't think anybody grows up as a kid. Oh, I'm going to manage apartment buildings one day, right? But
that's right.
it's so interesting to hear about the different paths. A lot of folks getting in early and leasing as their first job, either in
Right.
college or after college. There was even somebody who did it in high school, I think, and then staying in the industry. But I just had a guest that I recorded with who started in consulting and really had a big career before they switched over to multifamily. And it's such a cool thing to learn and talk about people's backgrounds. So I'm gonna keep with it. I'm really enjoying it.
I love it. I obviously have a bias for podcasts and love podcasts, and for all the same reasons, and probably a few more that you just cited. But
Okay.
Jonathan, it has been an absolute pleasure. I want to give you the opportunity to share where people might find out more about you or your company.
Yeah, thanks, Mike. The pleasure's been all mine. I've really enjoyed it, and great questions, by the way. I can tell you're obviously very good at this. Yeah, if folks want to find out more about my company, encourage them to check out our website, withme.com. And if they'd like to reach out to me directly, I'm very open to that. My LinkedIn is pretty easy to find. It's just my name, Jonathan Treble. There aren't many of us out there, so I'll probably show up if you put me in. And I'm very happy to connect with folks of all backgrounds, and I really enjoy connecting with entrepreneurs, fellow entrepreneurs. So, but really, to the extent anybody wants to connect and talk about book recommendations or leadership, happy to connect. So thanks for asking that.
Awesome. Well, we will link all that information up in our show notes. And once more, Jonathan, thank you very much for your time.
Thank you, Mike. Really had a great time.